Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Board Certification Program provided by Boardwise and sponsored by Watermark, WCD, and Mogul. We have an amazing program lined up over the next 8 weeks and trust you are as excited as we are to get started. But before we do, we'd like to share a few updates and ground rules. First off, please mute your lines until you ask a specific question, and you may use the chat room if preferred. Next, a recording of each session will be created and provided by the following week. Please keep your radar up for its arrival. Also, you've been asked to complete a board bona fide assessment. If you have not completed this yet, not to worry. You'll have until the end of the month to do so. Lastly, please be on the lookout for a Slack invite today. And of course, if you have any questions about that or the program, you're always welcome to contact me directly at justin.owens@hamlinharkins.com. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, without further delay, I'd like to introduce the CEO of Boardwise, Dr. Donna Hamlin. Donna, the floor is yours.
That's a very professional voice, Justin. Thank you. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for all of your interest and commitment to doing governance by preparing yourself. I did that when I was 24 years old, and I have to absolutely assure you that it made a huge difference in the way I became an executive, let alone a good board director. And the requirements going forward are getting more and more tricky and more complex. So putting the time in so that you do a great job is really important. And today is the first of the modules. So it's a little bit more of giving the guardrails for what we should expect when we're joining a board. And then we will go into more specific topics as we go forward. To start off, what I'd like to do is introduce you to Nola Masterson, where we can talk a little bit about what it means to get involved in the community of directors and why that's important. Nola, are you there?
I am here. Thank you very much, Donna. Donna and I have been working together for about 10 years. I sought her out after I got on my first publicly traded board after serving as a venture capitalist and working in very small companies, startup company boards. And I found that both experiences were important, but asked different skill sets. So Boardwise has become my go-to place for global corporate governance. And I also joined the Women Corporate Directors, and I became the co-chair of the San Francisco chapter. And I have had an association with other women and other board members for a long time, because I find that once you get on a board, it's not the end of your journey, it's actually the beginning. And you really want to have the camaraderie of other board members, whether they're on your board or some other board. So you're able to ask questions in a private and confidential manner about what did you do when this happened, or what do you think would happen for me if I did X, Y, and Z. And a lot of the insights and things that I've gained have come from going to board trainings like this one and going to the Women Corporate Directors annual conferences and meeting other board members. And so once you have your board certification, it really helps to find other people that are on boards, because that's where you're going to find your next board, is by socializing and becoming part of organizations like NACD, Women Corporate Directors, Women on Boards, Boardwise. All of them support your journey and the challenges and changes that are happening in governance and in the world today mean that you have to stay on top of your own education, and Boardwise is part of that.
Nola, what are the types of topics today that the members in WCD or board prospects or any of these organizations consider are the big challenges?
People, maintaining your people is probably one of the biggest challenges that's come out of COVID. And the laws around employment have changed a lot because working remotely has changed the needs and the desires of people. And that's one of the big board's biggest challenges, is because how do you maintain your talent? Because people are the talent of the company. Also, changes in governance in the world today. The laws are changing rapidly. I think you might have just seen that China has banned any cryptocurrency. That's a huge ban that changes the dynamics for anybody working in the cryptocurrency world. And there's a number of common challenges that every board director faces, no matter what the organization that they oversee. So preparedness is important. Corporate board usually seek senior advisors. They're senior people that have the big picture. And the most critical benefit of getting education is around cryptocurrency, cybersecurity, media, using social media. These are all things that, quite frankly, older board members are not as up to date on as maybe younger board members, which is why I think it's opening the door for people in their 40s and 50s and 60s to come on boards now, because you grew up in the era of computers. And a lot of the people that are running on boards are not from that era. So participating in this kind of a training will let you see what your skill sets are, so that when you go to market yourself, you've got them right at the tip of your fingers.
Nola, Susan was going to join us today, and because of a conflict, she couldn't. Did she offer some suggestions when you were talking with her for folks that are stepping into a job, a new board opportunity? What are the skills or the competencies that they should focus on before they join?
Well, it's really interesting because Susan sent me a long list of things that she was doing and talking about, but I think the highlights of what she said is it's most critical if you're sitting on a board that you're able to make a true contribution. And WCD, the chapters around WCD give you the ability to have the skill sets that you need. I think that being part of WCD has given me the ability to network with other people, other women, and make sure that if I have a question about something that's happening on my board, I have a trusted advisor that I can text. I think that it's important that you find a board that you're passionate about and where your purpose is aligned. Excuse me, I'm getting a call from the vet. My horse is sick and I can't take it, sorry. WCD is applauding what NASDAQ is doing. They've recently approved the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission Board Diversity Program, where over more than 3,000 companies that are listed on the exchange have to have a person of color and a gender diversity. So one of the things that they do that's really good is they jump on the bandwagon with their 76 chapters, which are global, and say women corporate directors supports this, women corporate directors supports that. The diversity and disclosure requirements that are highlighted by board composition are a means to champion inclusion and growth. And that leads to prosperity for the stronger economies and stronger companies. The movement is about writing a new chapter in corporate governance. Actually, it's a visionary in terms of its goal to capture expertise from an underrepresented group of highly qualified professionals, and that will lead to effective governance and to respond to the increasing complexity of businesses that businesses are facing today. So those are the words from Susan Keating, and she took over the helm of WCD after it had started 20 years ago, and has done an excellent job. She's now looking to retire, and many of us are looking forward to who is going to replace her at the helm, because the WCD is a wonderful organization and has a lot of global benefits, especially for women.
You look around the audience here, what would you suggest or advise to offer a new and inspiring director an opportunity? Strategies for getting started, or what do you suggest they do?
I think the first thing is to take the board bona fide assessment tool. I think that's probably the best thing that I ever did, because then I was able to really hone in where I was, where my long suit was as a board member, and where I could position my own gifts and talents when I would go to interview for a board position. But I really think that you want to look at it for a board that you have something in your background that says, I belong on this board. I have experience in this area, and I have something to bring to the table here. I've had a successful career in pharma, so I want to be on a pharmaceutical board, or I've been in SaaS sales for 15, 20 years, and I should be on a SaaS company board, because I actually know what happens at the level of the client. What is the product? What is the area where the product is going to be sold? If you have some really deep knowledge in that area, it's important that you put that on your resume. It's important that you also say how you operate. What are you, a unifier? Are you a challenger? Are you a change driver? A lot of the terminology that Donna and Boardwise has put into the board bona fide assessment tool actually helps when you're interviewing and looking for a board position. I think that board work is work that should be looked at as a calling rather than a job, because I think it's something you do after you've had a successful career. It's not something that you do once as a career. It's something you do almost like the icing on the cake of a good career. Good corporate governance requires that you have some background in good corporate organizational strategy, and where did you fit within your organization, and where did you help the strategy of your company, and where did it develop, and where did it grow? That leads to you saying, well, then I would be good for a company that's making scientific tools, for instance, because I worked at Millipore Corporation for 8 years, and I had to be a regional manager, and I had to train other salespeople to sell things. So I understood the whole process of how you develop a product, because I've been an entrepreneur and I've developed a product, but I also have the background of how do you get that product in the hands of salespeople, and then how do they translate that into the customer, and what does that mean to the company when they make their annual or their quarterly report to Wall Street. I hope that helps.
Well, opening it up, those of you that are listening, does someone have a question you'd like to ask Nola?
Hi, it's Rick. I'm curious, what are some of the unexpected, there's a lot of great things about it, but what were some of the, oh yeah, I didn't really realize that, like the stress was really high, or they only call me a Saturday night at midnight, or is there kind of a acid reflux part of this as well?
What's the downside of being on a board, Rick?
I like both sides, but
the downside is that when something goes wrong, it usually goes wrong really fast and really bad, and you have to go to work 24/7, and you have to have a relationship around your other board members where you can tackle that problem and solve it. That happens a lot, but not often. I've been on multiple boards, and it's only a matter of when, not if, something's going to go wrong. You need to fire and hire the CEO. That's always a very tense, and if you haven't planned for succession and you need to do that, that's always a very hard thing for most board members to wrap their heads around, of how do I exit the CEO and get a new CEO. So you got to remember that the board is responsible for hiring and firing the CEO and for onboarding other board members. So those are probably two of the most time-consuming and important jobs of a board. And when that transition has to happen, if you haven't had a succession plan in place and there isn't somebody that's obviously coming up from the organization willing to take over or able to take over the CEO role, you have to look outside. You have to be familiar with recruiters. You have to be familiar with how to interview a potential CEO. And obviously the role of CEO is different than the role of a board member, because they're going to have to be extremely hands-on and extremely operational, whereas that's not your role as a board member, but you need to put the person in place that's going to do that. So that's the downside. That's the real work I have found in my 30 years of serving on boards is there's never a CEO that goes the distance. There's startup CEOs, there's middle ground CEOs, there's execution CEOs, there's commercial CEOs, there's a CEO to take the company public. There's a certain CEO that can take the company to mergers and acquisitions. Every CEO has their different strategy. And as a board member, it's really important to get comfortable interviewing CEOs and hiring and firing them.
Any
I have a
other?
question, Nola.
Sure.
Actually, a couple of questions for you. So one of the things you said that this is something one should consider when you have reached almost close to the top of where you want to be in your career. I wanted to understand that a little more. Could it be like, I'm in a good place, but I still have aspirations for my own career while I'm also exploring getting on the board of a company? And second question would be, does it have to be exactly in the industry that I have been? Because I see, for example, I work at Juniper and I see our board members who are not necessarily tech, coming from the tech industry. So how important is it to stick to the industry that you have grown up in? And could you really add value or not to a different industry? So those are the two questions.
You can play with that for sure. Your deep dive or your area that you know well is not necessarily an area that you need to be on the board of, because a board role is more of a governance role and an overseer role, and it's not an
Right.
operational role. So you're absolutely right. You can be working in one area and serving on the board of a company that has nothing to do with that area, as long as you feel like what you do know about board work is additive to that board.
Mhm.
Okay. And in terms of career path, 40s and 50-year-olds are really sought after now because of their depth of experience, usually in the social media area, the cybersecurity area, the risk management areas around those things that happen, because they're new and they're not the beauty of what you're doing at your age is that people want to know what have you seen that I haven't seen, and I've been sitting on this board for 10 years, so let's get some fresh eyes on what's going on. So you bring that when you bring your skill set to the board. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Nola, I have a quick question for you, and that's very helpful to think about how boards are evolving to, a different generation for different perspectives, particularly on cybersecurity and social media. What is the thinking of board composition overall in terms of moving away from kind of the trusted, the roles that you seek in a board toward some more non-traditional roles, people with non-traditional backgrounds?
It's a good question, because I think that people from different backgrounds usually bring a different lens to the problems that are brought to the board. For instance, I was sitting on a board in Seattle that was developing a product for brain cancer. And yet the technology was such that it was electromagnetic, which was not normal pharma type of thing. And they brought on a board member that understood cancer. And then they brought in a board member that had started a home for mom, which it was a website where people would go to find a place to put your mother or your aging parent, because they understood that their marketing strategy was going to be important, because people that were suffering from brain cancer were going to a traditional doctor. But what if they found this company and could get enrolled in the clinical trial that they were having for brain cancer? And that was an outside of the box thinking kind of thing. But this man had developed the whole website for Home for Mom. They also brought in somebody from Starbucks, because that was a consumer product and a customer facing thing. And I think that they had a very strong board. At the end of the day, that board, I don't know what's happened to it because I got off the board, but not, it was very interesting to me to see the diversity around the table of that board, and how the different skill sets and lenses that people brought were very, I thought, important to the diversity of thought around the problems that the company faced at that time, which are always in startup companies, there are always fundraising problems, and how do we get more money into this so we can get, move the needle forward. But it also is an important thing, if you're going to take the company public, that you have a well-respected board on it at the time of the IPO. And then once you go IPO, you really want to have people that have got company experience, that have been public, that understand that. And this is where I find lawyers and people with corporate governance backgrounds are very helpful in publicly traded companies, because they're very familiar with the SEC regulations, and they're changing all the time. So you've got companies going public that are not traditional, like non-dairy company just went public, not meats company just went public. I mean, the landscape of IPOs in areas that people have never seen before has never been greater, because there's, new technologies that are allowing us to have meats that aren't meats and dairies that aren't dairy, and the pharma industry is always evolving to the next new thing. So is the tech industry, always looking for the next new thing. So a diverse board also is, not just diversity of gender, but diversity of backgrounds, diversity of thought, diversity of where am I coming from when I look at this problem, and coming with a lens of something that, maybe it's a dumb question, and there are actually no dumb questions for a board member. In fact, that's the main thing that a board member should do, is ask questions, ask good questions. And you can only ask good questions if you're confident in yourself and your background and what you're bringing, to say, excuse me, I don't really quite understand what you just said. Could you explain that to me a little bit better? Because the management knows what they're doing very well, because they do it 24/7. That's their deal. But board members come in, quarterly at best, and then have to be brought up to speed about what's happening. And so that's the time to really ask management to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it, and have an ability to put some input into what's going on.
Nola, Kim had a question.
Okay. Kim?
I'm interested, Nola, to hear you say that you appreciate having attorneys on boards. I've always thought that serving as counsel to senior leadership of a public R1 research university is very good practice for advising a board and its senior leaders as well. On the other hand, I hear people say all the time that they're not looking for lawyers on their boards. And so I'm wondering if you can say more about that.
I always look for lawyers on my boards, and you always have a corporate counsel, and their job is to represent the counsel the company. But a different perspective, if you're the board member, is not to be the lawyer on the board, but to be the backup for what could go wrong, because your training is what could go wrong here.
Yep.
Okay, it's not that you're corporate counsel, you're a board member. And so that's what you should say, Kim, when you're interviewing. It's because of my legal experience, I'm always looking for what could go wrong. And I'm your backup for on the board of what could go wrong, because believe me, you're trained in that, and not everybody is. Most people are trained in a profession of, well, I can do this and I can do this and I can, but you come from what could go wrong with that. So that's why I like to have lawyers on the board, because they usually say, hold on, wait a minute. What's the legality of that? What are the implications for the employees for that? What's the implications? What are the legal implications? And a lot of times corporate counsel will attend a board meeting and not speak up. As a board member with a law degree, you can speak up. And then they can get advice from their corporate counsel about what
I
they think.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, on that note, thank you, Nola, for your time and your contributions on this. Just so you all know, Nola's background in life sciences has gotten her to be the lead investor in a portfolio fund on Femtech. And we're doing a lot of work taking a look at those companies that are invested in by Portfolio to help them with their board seats. So Nola and I are constantly looking at those companies that are receiving the funds to see where they might benefit from folks like you that are looking to help with earlier stage or C-round companies. So stay in touch with Nola, because we'll see where there's some opportunities as we go forward once you're ready.
Yeah.
Nola, thank you for today.
You're welcome. I know you're in good hands.
All right, everyone, we are going to get started taking a look at the foundations of what you should know as guardrails for governance going forward. So it's a little bit more presentation oriented than the other modules will be, but bear with it. And we are going to do a simulation based on the case that you got to pre-read. So if we can get started with that. We'll take a look at these areas. Now I'm going to go a little quickly in some of them, but you will have not only the recorded version of this, but the deck itself. So feel comfortable that you don't have to take a whole bunch of notes as we go through this. You'll have the material from which to refer later. Now, just by getting started, I don't know how many of you might have asked this question of yourself, but I certainly did when I started. Why do we have boards in the first place? Because there aren't necessarily requirements for this. How did we get started on this? The board-centered model is not the only one that exists in history. There are certainly power plays, there's Sun Kings, there's partnership models. And somehow, when you look across the globe, the board model is the one that has won. Now, there is a belief, history, that created that as a possibility. There is decision thinking and history looking at that groups make better decisions than a CEO all by him or herself. And that people are looking for a fair way of having representation of people's views if they are the shareholders or the victims of whatever's going on. And so to protect people's interests in a better way, there has to be a cogent balance between those that have power, those that are executing, and those that are recipients of the outcomes. And clearly there's a history of looking at, we need some central management, a practical way when there are owners that are distributed and can't all be present every day. And being able to monitor the success over time has created this model of what we call a balance of power among these different parties. You've got executives, you've got directors, you've got shareholders. And when you create a board-centered model, you're able to keep all those voices accounted for in a reasonable way. That's the assumption, that's the goodwill of it. Now, this is the honorable assumption built into this, that when we have good governance, we have full accountability, we have transparency, we have probity, and we have focus on a longer term sustainable success. It is not incremental. It is not, let's make a decision today, we'll make another one tomorrow. Those are the principles that are assumed in good governance. Now, that's not to say that historically, as we look at governance around the globe, that it's always been adhered to, but it certainly is the aspiration. Now, many people have funny assumptions about what's expected from a board. And if you're working especially with the young companies where they don't really understand and they think that boards are an imposition, hold this set of principles in your mind. You're there to guide. And you are trying to help push the organization forward. So you want to be useful. If you can give access to resources that the business needs, that's a plus. And Nola made the comment about ask good questions. Your duty is the duty of curiosity. And you don't have to have all the answers, but you do have to have the right questions. And then be accessible to the other directors as well as the CEO between meetings. While yes, there is a formal cadence of a calendar, you do want to make sure that you're available for advisory support or answers to questions as they come up. You do have a complete right to ask questions of employees. Now that becomes a sticky wicket sometimes for CEOs that don't feel comfortable or they are not as confident. Their job is to make sure that employees feel perfectly okay if a director calls them and asks the question, because you have a right to ask anything to make it clear when you're trying to make decisions at the board level. So CEOs should make that clear to all the employees that if a director calls you, you go ahead and answer their questions. It's okay. Now you should also be there to encourage debate. Nobody should just be doing the yes, yes, yes to the CEO. There was a study that just came out a few weeks ago that talked about the research today that most directors are saying, oh no, we're here to just make the CEO comfortable. That's not the way it works. You really have to second guess some of the decisions that are being made and ask good questions. You're not just there to nod. And you can't assume that any of the directors or you in particular, to Nola's point earlier, should understand the details the way the management does. So it's perfectly okay to start asking more questions. And the group dynamics within a board have to include that everybody has an appreciative opportunity for viewpoints. If you don't have diversity of thought around the table, you don't have an optimum board in the first place, but you do have to have the emotional intelligence to accommodate the discussion of different views. It is the one model that is peer-based leadership. So make sure that you've got healthy group dynamics to be able to explore things together in a professional way. It's also important when you're joining a board to make sure that you're understanding whether the corporate agenda is about growth versus profitability, because the decisions that you make will be tied to whatever that ambition is. If you're joining a board because you have a strong suit for helping a company grow, that's a good fit. But if it's about profitability, it's going to be a different model. Make sure you know that up front. And the other thing that some of the boards make is to add charismatic property to the board, somebody with a star name. And when they do that, you end up having to add another director because they don't do any work. The directors have to do the work. So if you add a star to the board, make sure you're adding another director who's actually going to do something. And the other principle of now it's getting much more clear is that the CEO should not also be the chair. Those should be divided so that you don't have the conflict issues that have come up otherwise. Now, the other thing to understand about boards is that they are looking at the business in a context that is the long view, not the short view. So while a management team has the responsibility to look at maybe a year view and then present their proposal for the action plans and developmental issues of year to year, you as a director will be looking at it with 6 to 10 year vision. So your organization of priorities is the long view. And you'll notice that there are patterns depending on where you are in the world. For example, the UK is lengthening the time periods for their stock that they get as directors because they want people there longer to watch what their outcomes are in their long view. So normally you'd see a tranche when you're getting it up to 3 years. Now it's getting pushed out to 5 years. And looking at new practices that you can bring in for long view solutions, not short view. So let's take a look at just the basics that you need as you get started here. First of all, a board is typically anywhere from 5 to 12, but you know, the rule of thumb that people look for is make sure that you're on a board with an odd number. You want that because you want somebody who can break a tie. And the purpose of the board then is to serve for the long-term value for shareholders, stakeholders, and employees. Now, board member roles can change depending on what type of board you got, a startup, a nonprofit, pre-IPO. The duties are more rigorous as you go into the public board forum. But the 4 different types have different expectations associated with it. With your nonprofits, of course, you're doing a lot more of the raising of capital. If you're doing advisory board, which I love to do, by the way, is having acumen or a special competency or expertise that you're contributing to the kitchen cabinet of the CEO. You don't have the exposure rate that you do if you're stepping into the formal boards, which could be private or public. But there is no right or wrong answer as to where you think your strong suits belong. It's a choice. And many times you may find yourself in an opportunity where you're on an advisory board in one capacity, but you're on a formal board in another. We're going to be talking about board structure around the globe, but today, just taking a look at the typical common one is what we call a tier 1 structure, which is where you have the CEO on the board with the directors. And the composition of the directors traditionally are the investors who, as a function of what money they put into the company, have an entitlement to a seat on the board, and independent directors who are supposed to balance out the complaints or debates that go on between the investor directors and the management. So for example, I'm on a board right now and it has 4 investors who are on the board, 2 from management, the CEO and the technology inventor, and then I am the independent director. So I get to manage the debate between the 2 sides when the views are very different. Now, for opportunities that you're all looking at, the independent director role will be the one you'll be looking at. So if you think you're gifted in the way of handling those sorts of debates, that's a great opportunity to test your skills. Now, when you look at a 1-tiered board, it's very different than what you're going to learn next week, which is about 2-tiered and then Asia's version of 2-tiered. So depending on what kind of company you step into, be careful that you're understanding the design first, because if you happen to be on a company board that has footprints in other countries, you will be dealing with different structures. Now, in a 1-tier, you will see typically committees, and when you serve on a board, you are given a role within a committee as a secondary function. And today there are some evolutions happening within the structure itself. It used to be that there was an audit committee, a compensation committee, and a nom and gov committee. But so much is changing in terms of the stretch of duties of care that there are now new titles that are incorporating more obligations with it. Audit is now audit and risk. So they're looking at all the risk dimensions of the business, as well as the standard financial and auditing responsibilities. The new one, instead of compensation, is called human capital management, which includes compensation, but it is also picking up all of the requirements now to look at how well companies are handling their environmental and their social responsibilities and their governance mandates, because the filing requirements are now including data around that, which means that the board has to work with the management to actually find what metrics they're going to use to monitor how well they're doing. Nom and Gov is picking up more responsibilities. It's not just finding the new directors, like you folks, when you start finding opportunities, you'll be talking to people from the Nom and Gov, but it's also to do board evaluations. And secondarily to those three core ones, typically you will see ad hoc committees that will show up. One might be on strategy if there's a lot going on around that, or shareholder relations if there's a particular issue or need for it. Those could be additive. Now, if you're looking at nonprofits, they're different yet again, but those can be built out and then shut down later based on what might be needed in the organization. Kim, you had a question?
I have a question about audit and finance being the same committee, because the Bar Association board on which I served had two separate committees, and actually you could not serve on both the audit and the finance committee at the same time.
Right.
And so it's curious to me that this is both functions on the same committee.
No, they can definitely be separate and often are. And many times you will see yet again that the risk committee is separate.
Yeah.
So depending on the size of the board and how they can organize, there are trends right now that there are more directors because the work is so much more. And when you start making split committees, you need more people.
Thanks.
Yep. Let's see if we can. Now, typically, and Nola had said this and I started to smile, that the meetings are 4 to 6 times a year. Boy, during COVID, the board I was on met every Tuesday. So be prepared for whatever the cadence might be. But your general duties during that time are oversight. So the obvious duties, you're going to hire and on occasion fire a CEO. You're approving and overseeing the implementation of a strategy. There is a lot of confusion on the parts of people. They think they're supposed to describe or define the strategy, but that's not true. The board of directors approves what the management defines or rejects it if they feel it's not appropriate. They can review and make recommendations from committees, but the board has to do the approval. So sometimes there's confusion when committees think they have the power to create a policy change. They don't. They only have the opportunity to recommend it to the full board, and then subject to the full board's approval, it can then be applied. And you also have the duty to monitor the reputation of the corporate brand and oversee that. And of course, you've got interest to uphold and protect a full spectrum of people who are involved in this. It's no longer the belief that the US market always thought we're just here to protect the shareholders. The European corporations have stretched that duty, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the accountability is far bigger now than it ever was before. And then of course the committee time that you put in will be separate from the regular board meetings, and that can be different based on what's going on. When there are times in the course of the year that there's more work, for example, if you're doing the compensation stuff, it may have a big cycle at the time of promotions and changes of stock plans, and then quiet another quarter. So the cadence of that is something you should be sensitive to when you're thinking about which committee you belong to. Now, the time commitment, people ask this, on an average of 10 hours a month when you're combining the board and the committee work. If you've got availability for that, then you're in good shape. If it's going to be more, like something unusual is going on with the business, for example, a merger or acquisition consideration. Or Nola lost her entire Thanksgiving week one time because of one big topic for a board. Now, when you're looking at that, you make sure that you've got an expertise that you can contribute and make it align with which of the committees is appropriate, and then have the expertise to contribute it, and make sure that the style and the fit of the work that is needed is a good fit for what you have. The comfort zone of playing to your highest and best is a good way of screening out where you can serve. Now, these are the basic listed responsibilities of board members. You're making fundamental corporate decisions that are required by law. You're approving the goals and the strategies. You're monitoring for how well they're doing against that. You are determining the compensation and the stability of whether the CEO should stay or be removed. And you are participating in succession planning for the long term for the CEO and sometimes the executive direct. If you're in China, for example, you oversee not only the hiring and firing of the CEO, but every direct report to the CEO, which makes it hard to be a CEO in China because the CEO doesn't have the power to select the candidates, the board does. So depending on what world view you've got, you have different influence, if you will. But that's not all. You have to take the steps to ensure that there's appropriate financial disclosure, that you're overseeing the risk management systems to make sure those are done. You also are responsible for the ethical tone and statement of the reputation of the company. You're overseeing the fundamental or material transaction decisions that are made. You have to make sure that you're adhering to the governance protocols that are required by law. And you will also be subjected to and contributing to an annual board evaluation of yourselves as a board to see how well you're doing, which is why I say the biggest duty you have is to ask as many questions as you have. You do not have to be the genius, but you do have to know how to ask so that you can make good decisions. Now, how do we establish when we make decisions, whether we've done a good job and what our requirements are so that we're not exposed to any legal chasing? The first is called the fiduciary duty of care, which means that directors, when they make a decision, have to show a record that they have made that decision based on all the information they could get at the time. And they are deliberately making that decision in an informed way, not just a whimsical way. And that they believe that the actions that they're going to suggest or recommend are in the best interest of the company because of the work that they've done to investigate all the reasonable options. Now, the second part of that really is what they call the business judgment rule, which is, have we determined that we've done the best that we can? And if a director has done that and acted in goodwill and good faith on that, and had done what is considered a reasonable thing under those circumstances, then they will not be exposed to liabilities for making a bad decision if it was reasonably made at the time. With all that we understand at the time we make a reasonable decision, you will not have the legal exposure, provided you can show that you actually did your homework. Now, the second piece of this is the fiduciary duty, which is that you have a duty as a director to protect the interests of the corporation. So you have an obligation to refrain from anything that would injure the corporation or its shareholders, even if it may hurt you personally. So you can't have what's considered a conflict between your personal self-interest and the duties while you're sitting in a board. Now, where does that come up? Oftentimes it's coming up with investors who have requirements for their shareholder investment community, and they're sitting on the board and they've got a conflicted view on what's going to happen. That's a tricky conflict of interest. And so you have to know that when you step in as an investor, that your allegiance has to be to the corporation's best interest, independent of what your investors may be thinking. So the subset of that duty of loyalty is that you as a personal board member have to refrain from anything that would be a conflicted interest for yourself. So there's many examples now taking a look at transactions that you can't do what's called self-dealing. Anything that would be in your interest at the expense of the company cannot be done. And you also have to disclose if there's a vote on something where you may have a conflicted interest. If there's anything that's a potential conflict, you have to either abstain or you have to notify. Now, there are smaller activities on boards where your area of expertise may be required, and it is perfectly okay if the board approves that you contribute in a consultative way. For example, if you do executive coaching, for example, and there's a need for some executive coaching for one of the employees who's a direct to the CEO, they may approve that you could go do that and be paid a small extra amount of money for that. It's not a conflict if it's documented and approved, because you are doing something that's in the best interest of the company and probably in a more affordable way than if they went out to a third party. But you do have to get approvals on that and be conscientious. It's better to err on the side of making sure it's documented as opposed to just whimsically approved. Now, those conflicts of interest are getting interesting, especially when you're looking at venture-backed boards, because the joke is no conflict, no interest, but these dual fiduciary duties are something you should always screen for when you're looking at the earlier stage companies, to make sure that they are honoring that requirement of duty to the business over duty to the investment group itself. And here are some examples of some of the caseload that's happening coming out of Delaware on areas where companies have not adhered to that. And it seems to have been bubbling up a lot in Silicon Valley boards, where these co-ownerships in intangible assets and things are a conflict. And board directors who are using the planes that the company own or things like that, that are coming up as lawsuits now. So do your homework and make sure that the onboarding process when you join has well documented the protections against this, because once you're on a board and the board does get sued, you can't escape it. You're nailed with it. So make sure you do that pre-screen. Now, the other issue with Silicon Valley, I suppose, but anything with the spirit of entrepreneurship, is to make sure that your governance models are upheld. When you start looking at entrepreneurs, many times they will try and avoid these requirements and things because they're in the way of the spirit of, we want to get things done. So if you take a look at a company today like Velodyne, which was started by an entrepreneur who had some great engineering design ideas for equipment that goes into autonomous vehicles, and was not adhering to all of the regulatory environmental things that are required when they took the company through a SPAC, and now there's lawsuits going back and forth and in between, and it's a big mess. So it's great that we have entrepreneurial ideas, but there has to be a respect for the protocols that are required for regulatory reasons at the same time. Do your homework to make sure that that doesn't cause a big problem among the parties as you go forward. How do you start? The first thing you should ask for is to make sure that you get a copy of the bylaws, because that's pretty much the Bible of the business, and you want to take a look at what's documented there, and the articles of incorporation. Get those so that you have the framework from which you can understand where in this business these components actually are operating, especially if you're in a company that crosses boundaries, because the components and the way they work will be different by country. Now, the other item I mentioned is that you will be subjected to a board evaluation, and that could mean a lot of different things depending on where the maturity of the business is. I published an article on this a number of years ago, taking a look at what is defined as a board evaluation. The first mandate was that boards had to do it, and then they had to publish something in their proxy filings that they completed it. And the first round was typically the board all looked at each other, slapped themselves on the back and said, hey, we did a good job this year, right? And then they wrote that in. But the requirements for what they do thereafter have gotten more sophisticated. And making a list would be another way of doing it, which is kind of perfunctory, where they make a list and then they all check off whether they actually completed X, Y, and Z. Now, it has become much more sophisticated in the way of whether they do it for themselves, which is legally all that is required is that you look at how well you're doing. What mandates are changing depend on the country. Now, if you're in Vietnam and you're on a board, not only do they have to have a third party do the board evaluation on you, they also have to present all the findings at the shareholder meeting. So it's full transparency. Here in the United States, it's done typically through the GC to hold the data protected so that activists or others will never have access to it. Because here in the United States, we're pretty afraid of lawsuits and interruptions. So depending on where you are and what kind of business, you're going to be looking at some kind of board evaluation. Now, we would recommend, of course, because we do them, that it's done by a third party, because you're going to look at best practices in a different way. And you can expect that those will be annual evaluations with a set of metrics that will be looked at each year. Although sometimes companies will get a little sophisticated and say, because of what we've been working on this year, we want to focus on certain topics, not all topics, and that's fine. But typically it could be a dozen key performance criteria. And what you're doing is just what I'd call, from an athletic standpoint, your personal best. Each year you're monitoring to see if you're getting better and better. Now, the reason this is important now is that most companies, after the collapse of the banks, were going into experimental mode. And we don't know which practices under experiment are actually going to show long-term return. So studying for best practices over time is the only way we're going to get smarter about which things that we change actually help, as opposed to just teach us something. So this is a list of the typical topics that you would see that you would be held accountable for, or you would have some insight into. It is very common now to have a 360 as part of this. So you'll be looking at your own self-assessment, but you'll also be scoring the other directors and giving a peer evaluation on that. So just be prepared. It's not different than you would at an executive 360, except it's peer-to-peer looking at it, as well as looking at the corporate metrics so that you can see a correlation between the things that you're doing and the impact it has on the business itself. Now, we say having a third party do it is the best way, although many companies do it with themselves, and that's fine too. So you can push for something that would be what you think is better, but a no conflict of interest approach is typically the cleanest of the ways to do it. Now, another thing, and interestingly enough, for those of you that have already filled out the BBF, that tool isn't something we made up just for the heck of it. The European companies were under a new mandate to include in their proxy filings a definition of how the group dynamics at the board level, how healthy they were. And they were reaching out to us and saying, we have no idea, how do we show the health of our group dynamics? And we have a lot of psychometric modeling expertise in our firm. So we started to take a look at what is the health of a robust group of people if they're working together. And this is, you'd think from the data here that look at all these aspects of governance. You'd think all those things would contribute to the effectiveness of the board. But the one factor that did make a difference was, can they work as a peer-based team well? That's the one variable that made a difference. So we did some research on the orientation of problem solving as the basis for debate and ideation going up. And if we could find what the styles of problem solving were and see a group that was holistically representative of those different styles that could perform well, then you would have great board dynamics. So when you're filling out your BBF, what we're looking for are those styles, because every one of them contributes something. And those of you that have filled it out and find out that you're a unifier contribute related to your style with people. You're the social moire people. You hold people accountable to the rules. You have diplomacy skills. You are gifted at making every voice be heard. It's a great contribution. Advisor experts are the deep domain experts that bring and save everybody else from having to learn something up. Now, as we talk about styles like that, there's always a shadow side that goes with the style. So if you're a unifier, harmony matters. You want concordance, you want group discussion that's healthy, and then you want them all to be happy with the conclusion that they make. What happens under a stressful model like that is, imagine you were sitting at a board table and there's a heavy debate on a complex issue and finally they all agree, but you're scratching your head because something's bothering you about that decision. You would say, I'm going to zip my thought because everybody's so happy right now and I don't want to blow that. So the downsides are something to be sensitive to, so that you know you still have an obligation to put that concern on the table, even if it is going to mess up everybody's happiness for the moment, because you want to make your decision stronger. And, you know, if there's anybody who could do it better than a unifier, I don't know who it is, because their diplomacy skills are good, but you have to be mindful of that shadow side of every style. An advisor expert is so respectful of the time it took to be an expert in an area, they tend to be reticent to speak up on topics outside their swim lane. So we have to encourage advisor experts to engage more at a strategic level across the bands of the business. Challengers are great at articulating, here's where we are today, we want to get to here. They're not necessarily as gifted as the change drivers on, I got 90 ideas on how we could do that. So when you band the change driver with the challenger, then you have the dynamo energy to go forward, and they create the possibilities in the imagination. And then the unifiers say, well, I know how to organize the people for that. And the advisor experts say, well, let's look at some of the guardrails for it. So that combination is what makes a difference. Now, the statesperson in the middle is the oddest, the rarest, I shouldn't say oddest, rarest of all, in that 1 of 900 people actually show up as this. And they have an equal amount of all the 4. And so they become a very good broker when people are not understanding each other. And they can also move a debate to a decision. So if somebody shows up as a statesperson, they tend to have that job forever because they're hard to replace. Having said that, though, the default person who typically would get the chair of the board slate would be a unifier because of the diplomacy skills that are there as an alternative to a statesperson. So understanding your style as you go through the BBF is part of what you're bringing to the board, and you need to be able to accentuate that, and then also screen to make sure that you're not joining a board that is homogeneous. I mean, if you're a change driver and you join a board that's all change drivers, you don't have a board, you have a party. Everybody has a great time, but nothing gets done. So you want to make sure that there's that balance. Here's an example of a scattergram when we took a look at the styles for a large bank in Europe. And this is the distribution. And you can see that, you know, there's a poor advisor expert sitting there by himself. And, you know, that distribution is pretty good. But what they were looking for is, how do they compose 3 regulatory boards with this talent, because they had offices in different countries. So what we can do with looking at the styles is to create boards with the right composition so that you've got something going forward. So there's value beyond just knowing what you bring. It's also how you compose a board and committees as well. Now, I did mention that there is exposure with this. So it is important that you take a look and check to make sure that there's D&O insurance, because there is liability insurance to cover directors, and make sure that, you know, it's a little trickier to get it for the privately held companies, especially at early stages, but it's also good to make sure that you are getting the coverage that you need for the decision making that you're going to do. And the policies are written, and, you know, read, find out what you're getting coverage for. And it's also true, I've noticed, because we're going through this right now on the board I'm on, that as we move from pre-IPO to public company, that the costs for that are growing. They're very expensive, so make sure that you're checking that you've got the appropriate coverage that you need. All right, so what should companies be doing? They should be determining the type of board it actually needs and then screening candidates that map to the gaps that they need for their long-term views. And it will be traditionally the Nom and Gov committee that's interviewing and recommending directors to the board. So when you're being considered, you will be talked to by the Nom and Gov directors first. And then the board has to approve and make the appointments and the offers. So they should be setting the expectations for a job description of the director, what the duties and obligations of that are, and then provide an orientation or an onboarding kit that includes not only the requirements for the duties for the board, but also the committee and what the terms and the limits are and what the compensation will be. Now, your task is to know exactly what you bring to the table. What are the skills that you can sell or offer? And where in the life cycle of a business do you best fit? Are you a player for early stage, C round, where they've got traction and they need more gift and in growth, a distressed company, a turnaround? You have privilege to choose that, but know where you will feel most comfortable, because differentiating you from other candidates has to come from your area of competence as well as your preference for work. Now, for example, we did this program, I don't know, 7 years ago or so, and Yvonne Wassamar, who's the CEO of Puppet, went through that. And now we've placed her on several boards. And I called her about a month ago because we had an opportunity for something in Canada that would be very good fit for her, but it's an earlier stage company. She said, I have just, in this 6 years, taken 7 companies through the IPO. I am now an expert at this, and I think that's where I belong. And so she passed on that because it was earlier than where she could apply what she's invested so much time in learning. So your decisions may evolve as a function of your experience as you go forward, but know where you want to focus first, and then write your board bio targeted with that. Because if you write a generic one, no one will know how to find you. And then do your homework before. It's flattering to be invited, but do your homework. Make sure that you're doing the due diligence. It goes both ways. Ask questions and evaluate whether this is a good fit match for you. Because your first experience is the trickiest one. And then after that, you will have more. It's the catch-22. You get your first one and then you're going to get more. But you want your first experience to be a really good one. And I would just caution, because we're sitting in Silicon Valley here, not all of you on the call are, but screen for the functionality of that board. It's perfectly okay to ask, how healthy is this board? Do the entrepreneurs know what they really want and respect what a board can do? Because oftentimes the early CEO, first-time CEOs, they've got all kinds of conflicts going on and they don't understand what a board is about. So make sure that you're doing your homework, that they understand and they really want it, as opposed to they're being imposed upon to do it. And make sure that if they're not, that you pass, because you don't want your first experience to be one where you're doing all the training on an executive team that is just frustrated by it. Now, if we shift for a minute here, just to tee up a little exercise that I'd like us to do, let's take a look at the governance landscape today. Now, if we define good governance, it's not the same by region. Because of all the experiments that have gone on now, the US focus is to protect the value of the shareholders much more than in Europe, which is protect everything. The shareholders, the stakeholders, the employees, the society, the climate. They are trying to cover everything. So if you're going to serve on a European board, you can't sleep. It's just a lot of work. And in China, it's much more about balancing the interests of shareholders, the government's influence on businesses, and the employees. So these views are contextualizing the way we do board work. Now, when the collapse of the banking systems happened, all kinds of things were up for grabs. Everybody started to say, okay, it's such a mess. What do we change? People started experimenting on the structures, which you'll learn more about next week, shifting from 1 to 2 to sideways tiers, redefining what our accountabilities are, which is why Europe started pushing so much of the accountability duties in a big way, changing the processes, re-guessing the leadership and the committee structures, redefining the skills and the competencies or whatever efficiencies we are, and holding ourselves accountable to board evaluations, which never happened before that. Now, at a global level, we can say these things about governance. Yeah, we should be doing our duties in an honorable way. We should make sure we're competent, we're transparent, there's checks and balances, that we're ethical, that we've got diversity and constructive communication across all parties. That's all the goodwill. But when you really look at national philosophy, the orientations are different. There is one that says, if we have checks and balances, then we won't have abuse of power, as long as we have good checks and balances. Another is, if we've got people who behave well and they're ethical and they follow the moral rules, it'll be okay. Then there's another philosophy on market discipline, which says the market will put pressure on the companies in that market, so we'll let them push and nudge. And then there's another for, no, the rules and the processes, if we create those and we follow them, we're good. And then another is market ordering, which says, yeah, the fix of the system is going to come from the governance that's implied by our industry. So when the bank starts to create regulatory mandates on top of what the stock exchange does, they're overseeing their own market. Now, you may have your own personal belief about governance and which of these factors makes a difference, but let's just take a look. If you were thinking, which one do you think has the strongest suit or influence? Here's what the governance orientation was before the financial crisis. Governments were saying checks and balances and market discipline, and the economists were saying market discipline. And then we had the financial crisis, and everybody said, well, shoot, that didn't work. So all these experiments that you will now be party to are coming out with, all right, well, that didn't work, so let's take a look at behavior and market ordering and more around the rules of the game and expanding the requirements, which is why all of this diversity and the push for behaviors and measuring how we work well together is a function of this reaction, if you will. Now, countries have different ways of experimenting. The UK is shifting more to the checks and balances. China's trying to figure out power plays between the government, and Europe is doing a really nice mix of those, and the US is going from checks and balances to rules and processes. So knowing where your business operates is going to be important. But this gets complicated. This gets complicated because the orientations of problem solving will be different. So what we know is that nothing sits above the nation state to adjudicate when there's a difference of philosophy. So if you are stuck with a problem that's crossing boundaries, there is no rightful body that you can go to that will tell you how to solve the problem when there's a disagreement across those bands, which of course is the predicament in the case that I sent you to pre-read. So if we can take that as our situation, what I ask you to do now, and Justin's going to put you into 2 different teams, and you will become the board. And Dara, if you will be the board chair for one of those, and Serbi, if you will be the board chair for the other one, assuming, Justin, you've got those two in separate groups, you'll have the next 25 minutes or so to, as a board, deal with the situation. Figure out what you're going to do to solve the predicament that this poor board is dealing with right now. And Justin, if you can put them into two groups, that would be great. Okay, everybody's back. It was your first board meeting. And as typical to first board meetings, you usually don't know what the heck's going on. So it was a good example, but let me hear from room one, maybe a couple minutes of where you landed so far. Anne's group, I think. Anne. And you go off mute and tell us what happened in your room.
So I might turn it over to Kim
Okay.
to walk through it.
All right.
I think she took the notes for us.
Okay.
Sure. So we started to talk about what the potential problems were that we were facing, and then came up with a list of things that we would consider doing in order to mitigate those challenges. It included bringing on a Chinese legal advisor to better understand what our options are there, file a claim with our D&O carrier to make sure that we're covered. Having legal counsel reach out to understand the timeline that we're facing with the SEC, because we weren't clear there either. Hiring another firm to do a full audit to replicate or to do what Deloitte had done and make sure that we have an independent assessment. Working with a crisis communication expert firm and putting together a campaign to be prepared for any communications that we need to make. And then consulting with an investment banking firm to understand how deep a trouble we might be in from the stock perspective and what our options are, considering delisting, potentially going on another exchange in the future. But first we want to understand how much trouble we're in before we make a decision there.
Great. At least you were exploring options and trying to get the data so that you can make good decisions. Excellent. Samina, how about your group?
Yes, very similar. We didn't have all of the information to make a cut and dried conclusion. So very much the same. We wanted to have someone independently look at the records and understand, what happened. The one board member who had earlier said the forensics investigation on our accounting was spot on. Should have done that. We would also bring on a government relations firm or people to help navigate the US-Chinese diplomacy issues. We talked about bringing in lawyers also. Nowhere in this brief was there mention of any legal counsel, which is frightening. We talked about crisis communications firm, knowing where that is. We talked about starting to look at Chinese investors to help us potentially in future look at perhaps going private, but starting that process now so we know what the options are. We talked about D&O. We didn't talk about filing a claim, so that was actually a very good one. And then I think we just didn't have enough information to make a conclusion. We did also talk about management changes, because it really, and we look at ourselves, of course, because we signed off on these records, but we also have to look at the chief financial officer and the CEO and look at what kind of changes we might make for that as we work through everything.
Good. Well, I'll share a little bit of what actually happened, because this is a real case. It's not made up. When Deloitte was in this squeeze, they didn't know what to do. So they turned the records over to the SEC version in China and said, we can't deal with this. So the stock exchange here made a case to the government in China saying, we need these records. And China said, no, it's held by us. So they tried negotiating by then China saying, well, you can come and look at those records in a private room with us. And of course, our exchange said, well, that's fudged data. We're not going to do that. So it got stuck. And then the exchange said, all right, all of the powerhouses that do the auditing, Deloitte's and every other firm, cannot get on this exchange unless they conform with this rule. And they took Deloitte's business off the exchange, and they had to have companies change it out, which was pissing off everybody. And so this debate wasn't getting solved enough. And so then China said, well, if you're going to treat it like that, then we'll take those companies off the exchange and put them on ours. And the companies didn't want that because the Chinese exchange was nowhere near as robust as the US one, which miffed the companies as well. And so they're sitting there, and then China says, all right, if you're going to play that game with all these powerhouses, then we now say Deloitte and all of the other firms cannot operate in China unless they are owned by a Chinese accounting firm. So all these big houses had to go find a co-owner of the registered entities to do business in China. It was just a huge mess where everybody's getting punished across their service portfolio. And because nothing sits above the nation state, it is still waiting to be heard in court. All these years later, it has still not been heard in the international court. So these problems are a function of people assuming that when we do business and we cross a boundary, that our governance model is going to be fine for where we are. It's not true. So we have to do our homework, because imagine you're on that board. The only answer to get that compliance would have been to have one of the directors move its family to the United States and never go back to China and give the records as required. That would have been the only escape hatch to have the compliance. And imagine if you are on the board, you're likely going to be family and roots there. They're going to get punished by the Chinese government at the end. So no one was going to solve it that way. The whole thing tanked. The business went off the exchange. They had to do things all over again. Getting back on the exchange was never going to happen. So these are problems. And I will share with you that with your board work, what you're mostly doing is understanding what your duties are, but it's the dilemmas where the decisions have to be made as a group in real time that you can't plan for. You have to react to. So this class is to just tee that up. Now, next time, we're going to learn a little bit about more global governance models and how that affects us going forward with Fred, who will be teaching that module on Friday. Between now and then, I will be sending you some more material to continue a little bit on what the trends are in the market today for governance models, so that you can just read that as a prep. Unless I do it as a voice over some of the slides, I may do that too, but I will send it. And I'm going to send you another little dilemma that you can read. And so that you can start to see these dilemmas pop up, and you can read it and think about what you would do to handle that. And then I'll tell you what the real answers from other directors would be if it were their problem when you get it next week. So with that in mind, unless there's questions, I want to thank you all for doing your homework and getting going on this one. And as you move forward, you're going to see that we're going to get into deep categories. There is a little adjustment in the schedule because we had two of the facilitators who've asked to switch. So we'll send you the order and the invitation again with that adjustment. You're not losing anything. They just had conflict, so they agreed to switch. So you'll get your digital transformation on a different date than the other. But you're going to hear from experts and speakers on all of these topics. And I want to thank you for being great at the first round, and we'll see you next week on Friday. Any questions, comments, snide remarks? Kim?
I have a question.
Okay.
The resolution, you were saying the only solution would be for an individual director to move to the United States and turn over the records. Doesn't that put that individual in any jeopardy in China?
That's why they could never go back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. They'd have to take their entire family and they'd have to move and never go back.
Oh, like a complete defection. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right, that would have been the only solution, and nobody has the courage to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all for your time today, and we will look forward to seeing you on Friday next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Donna,